The noose swung gently in the prairie wind, its frayed fibers catching the last red light of dusk. She stood on the makeshift gallows, eyes wide but unblinking, her white dress stained with the dust of the trail and the whispers of betrayal. Below, townsfolk gathered with torches in hand, not for light, but for judgment. A preacher prayed, a mother wept, and a rider watched from the ridge, his eyes sharp as flint, his heart pounding like war drums beneath bone and braid. They called him savage, but as the rope tightened, he moved like a shadow torn loose from the earth, swift, silent, unstoppable, and in one stolen breath she vanished from their grasp like a ghost in the desert wind. They never forgave him. But she never forgot him. Subscribe now, because tomorrow's story will haunt you even deeper. You'll need it. But before that, let me take you to the day it all began. The wind always carried more than dust through Dry Creek. It carried memories, too. Faint echoes of things unsaid, stories half told in the spaces between church bells and cattle cries. The town looked like it had been left behind by time itself, the buildings sun-bleached and leaning, as if they too were tired of standing. Was a place where everyone knew everything, and pretended they didn't. Maeve Callahan walked its wooden boardwalks like a ghost in plain sight. Her limp was subtle, but constant, the result of a fall from a horse 3 winters ago. Some said the horse was spooked. Others whispered it was her late husband who'd pushed her, just before he took a bullet in a poker game no one cared to win. Either way, the town had already decided she was cursed. They didn't say it to her face, of course. They never did. She lived in a small cabin just beyond the chapel, with a garden overgrown and a gate that creaked like it was morning. Her hands were always stained with soil or ash, and her eyes, green, wide, and always watching, seemed to carry more weight than a woman her age should bear. No one visited, not since the funeral. She had spoken once in the church, trying to explain what had happened that night. But her words came out too slow, too uncertain, her voice shaking like the candle flames behind her. They didn't believe her. Or maybe they didn't care to. What mattered to them was that her husband was dead. Her child was gone before it ever took a breath, and she was left, damaged, alone, and too quiet to be innocent. The scar on her cheek didn't help either. Faint, but visible, like a crescent moon carved into her skin. She didn't hide it. She had stopped hiding things long ago. The children in town sometimes stared. The wives looked away. And the men, well, they looked too long, or not at all. Maeve found solace in patterns, morning tea, sweeping the porch, feeding the chickens, writing letters she never sent. She read old novels under the sycamore tree and folded handkerchiefs like prayers. It was a life lived small, but it was hers. She didn't expect kindness anymore, just quiet. But even quiet can become unbearable when it stretches too long. Sometimes, she stood by the window and watched the horizon, waiting for a rider that never came. She didn't know who she hoped for, only that hope itself hadn't died. Not entirely. Not yet. Then came the rumors. It started with cattle found dead, their bodies oddly untouched. Then, a stagecoach robbed without a single gunshot. Finally, a man, a rancher, was found outside town, bruised, muttering about a demon in war paint who let him live with a warning. Whispers swirled like smoke. Apache, savage, heathen. The words were sharp, designed to cut. Maeve listened from the edges of rooms, her presence half forgotten but always felt. She noticed how the townsfolk grew louder when afraid, how they clung tighter to their prejudices like amulets. They spoke of forming a posse. They spoke of fire. They spoke of blood. But no one spoke to her. Not even Reverend Shaw, who used to place flowers on her step after Sunday service. Not anymore. She had become a part of the landscape, unmoving, uninvited, unnoticed. Until that day. It was just past noon when the sheriff came riding fast down Main Street, sweat lining his collar, and a telegram in his hand. He didn't read it aloud, but by sundown, everyone knew. A homestead had been burned north of the ridge. The family hadn't been found. Maeve heard it from the blacksmith's boy, who always gave her news before he was told not to. But it wasn't the fire that made the townspeople gather that night. It was the name. They said someone had seen her out near the ridge 2 nights before. She walks the trails like she's one of them now, someone muttered. She ain't never been right since her man died. She's got Apache blood. Don't you see it? None of it was true. But truth was never required when fear was involved. Maeve didn't run. She stayed in her home, lit her lamp, and sat at the table. She waited. She didn't cry. She didn't pray. She simply folded another letter, pressed it closed, and placed it beside the others. They came at dawn, a knock that wasn't a knock. It was a demand. Boots on her porch, hands rougher than needed. A voice that told her she was to stand trial. No jury, just an accusation. Accessory to murder, harboring a savage, consorting with the enemy. She didn't fight them, didn't scream. There was no one left to scream for. They took her through town in silence. No one looked her in the eye. But all eyes were on her. As the jail door shut behind her, she finally let herself exhale. Not in fear, but in surrender, and still. Outside, far beyond the town's edge, a hawk circled, watching, waiting. Something was coming, and it would not be quiet. They said the wind changed that morning, shifted east, brought with it the smell of rain and something else. Something older. The jailhouse was small, just one cell and a cot no softer than the floor. Maeve sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight despite the weight pressing down on her. She hadn't asked for food. She hadn't spoken a word. Sheriff Calhoun stopped checking on her after the first day. She unnerved him. Women were supposed to wail, plead, confess. But she only watched, like she could see something he couldn't, on the third morning before the sun had risen above the church steeple, the stranger came. No one saw him enter town. One moment, the wind was howling. The next, it stilled, as if holding its breath. And there he was, standing outside the sheriff's office, his horse cloaked in dust, his silhouette carved from dawn itself. He wore no badge, no spurs, just worn. Buckskin, leather darkened by time and feathers braided into his hair, raven black, touched with gray. His eyes were the kind that didn't blink easily, eyes that had seen too much and still saw more. He said nothing, just stepped inside. The sheriff stood from his desk, startled. "Can I help you?" The man only looked past him, toward the cell, toward her. Maeve, who hadn't risen in 3 days, stood. They stared at each other. Something passed between them. Not recognition, not exactly, but understanding, a question, an answer, a knowing. The sheriff moved between them, uncomfortable. "She's awaiting trial." Still, the man didn't speak. But he moved, quietly, deliberately, placing something on the sheriff's desk, a small pouch. It jingled softly. Gold. The room went still. The sheriff's jaw tensed. "You think money buys her freedom?" The man finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, wind-worn. "No. I buy her time." Outside, a few townsfolk began to gather. They'd seen the horse, the feathers. They were whispering already. The sheriff hesitated, torn between pride and fear. Finally, he took the pouch. "One day, that's all I'll give you." The man nodded once, then stepped to the bars. Maeve didn't speak, but her hand moved to the scar on her cheek, her fingers brushing it lightly, as if it burned beneath his gaze. He said nothing. But he took out a thin blade, a simple tool, bone-handled, and, with slow care, loosened the lock. Not broke, just opened. She stepped out, unsure of her own feet. He didn't touch her, just turned and walked, and she followed. They walked in silence past the stables, down the narrow path behind the chapel. People stared, of course, but no one stopped them. No one dared. He led her to the edge of town, where the trees thickened and the hills began to rise. There, they sat beneath a cottonwood, its branches heavy with spring. For a long time, neither spoke. Then quietly he said, "Your name." She looked at him. "Maeve." He nodded once. "Mine's Tahu." She tasted the name before she repeated it. Tahu. It sounded like wind through canyon walls, like stone warmed by fire. He didn't ask what she'd done. He didn't ask if she was guilty. He only said, "They're afraid of what they don't understand." She gave a half smile, one that never reached her eyes. "Then they must fear me a great deal." He looked at her, not through her, not around her, at her, like she was not a ghost, not a rumor, but real. Whole. "I see differently," he said. And somehow, that was enough. That night, she didn't sleep in her cabin. She stayed beneath the stars, near his fire, wrapped in her own shawl, but closer than she'd allowed herself to be in years. He told her stories, without names, without endings. About rivers that disappeared into stone, about horses that never tired, about his mother's lullaby sung in a language the wind had tried to steal. She listened, and when he paused, she spoke, slowly, softly, about the child she lost. The way the world stopped when it happened. The way it never started again. He didn't pity her. He just listened, like every word mattered. And when she finally fell silent, the fire popped once, sending a spark into the dark. She looked up. "Why me?" Tahu stared into the flame. "Because you didn't ask me to leave." By morning, the town was boiling. The preacher's wife said she'd seen Maeve walking with the savage. The butcher claimed he'd stolen something, though he couldn't say what. The blacksmith's boy said he saw the man touch her hand, and that was enough. "They're in league," the whispers said. "He's here for vengeance." Sheriff Calhoun watched the people gather outside his office and felt the heat rising. His gut told him it wasn't justice they wanted. It was a spectacle. He knew Maeve didn't stand a chance. That night, someone carved a message into her cabin door: "Leave or hang." But she wasn't there to read it. She was with Tahu, in the hills. They walked together now, not far, but enough to be unseen. She asked him about the land, where the birds nested, where the deer drank. He showed her tracks she never noticed before. He taught her the sound of silence. How to listen, not just hear. They didn't touch, but the space between them grew, smaller with each step. She asked finally, "Will you leave when the day's up?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "Do you want me to?" She didn't speak, but her hand brushed his. Brief. Bare. Enough. He turned toward her. Slowly, their foreheads touched. Not a kiss, but something older. And the wind shifted again. Back in town, a vote was cast. Unofficial, unspoken, but unanimous. Maeve would hang. The crime didn't matter anymore. Fear had decided, and they would carry it out at dawn. The note on her door should have been enough. But Maeve still returned the next morning to fetch the last of her things. Her mother's shawl, a faded photograph, and the worn journal she hadn't dared open in months. The air was heavy with silence, unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. She stepped inside, leaving the door half open. That was her mistake. The boots came fast behind her. 3 pairs. The door slammed. She spun too late. Men, faces half familiar. The preacher's eldest son, the barber's cousin, another with a scarf pulled high. Cowards made bold by shadows. They didn't touch her, not really. But they didn't need to. "You don't belong here, Maeve," one said, knocking her journal from her hands. The pages spilled across the floor like wounded birds. "You think because you walk with one of them, you can be one of us again?" Another sneered. The third only spat at her feet. They didn't strike her. No. But humiliation comes in more ways than bruises. They left as suddenly as they came, laughing down the road. When she tried to collect her pages, she found some torn, others soaked by the broken pitcher they'd shattered. Her hands trembled, her breath caught, and then she ran. Not toward the hills, not toward Tahu. She didn't feel worthy of that. She just ran. The forest had grown colder overnight. The wind cut through the trees like it had forgotten how to be gentle. Maeve moved blindly, stumbling over roots and fallen branches. Her ankle throbbed. Old injury awakened. Her shawl snagged on a bramble and tore. By the time the first flakes of snow began to fall, she was no longer sure where she was. She collapsed by a half-frozen stream, hands wrapped around herself, eyes staring at nothing. Her chest burned, but not from the cold. She hadn't cried in years. Now the tears wouldn't stop. She thought of her child, of her husband's silence before the gun went off, of the townspeople so eager to condemn, of the look in Tahu's eyes when he said, "I see differently." She wished he hadn't. She didn't want to be seen anymore. The sky dimmed. Her hands grew numb. Snow gathered on her skirt like soft, cold ash. Then, a sound, barely more than a breath. A twig snapped. She didn't turn. "I told you I'm fine." A pause. Then the warmth of a coat draped over her shoulders, soft, weathered, familiar. "I know," said Tahu. "But I came anyway." She turned her head slowly. He knelt beside her, not touching her, not asking questions. Just there. His eyes scanned, her face, the swelling under her eye, the thin red line on her palm. Anger flickered there, deep and quiet, but he said nothing of it. Instead, he reached into the satchel at his side and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he poured dried berries into her palm. She blinked. "Eat," he said. "I don't want—" "Eat anyway." She did. Slowly, bitter, sweet, grounding. When her hands stopped shaking, he took her injured ankle gently in his hands. No sudden movements. He pressed, tested, then wrapped it in cloth from his own tunic, all without a word. When she finally found her voice, it came as a whisper. "Why do you keep coming back?" He didn't look at her, just tied the cloth tighter. "Because no one else does." She blinked again. He continued. "You think you were left behind, but you weren't. They just never came far enough to find you." Her throat caught. "And you did?" He met her eyes now. "I see where the world breaks. That's where beauty hides." And something in her cracked open, not shattered, softened. She leaned forward, forehead against his. Not a kiss, just closeness, warmth, the steady rhythm of two breaths learning to match. They stayed like that until the snow stopped falling. When they returned to his camp, she moved more easily. He lit a fire. She boiled water. For the first time in what felt like lifetimes, they laughed, softly, a single shared story about a squirrel that stole Tahu's tobacco pouch. She confessed she used to sing before the accident, that her voice never came back quite right. He said he'd never heard singing that didn't carry sorrow anyway. They fell asleep beside each other, back to back, but not alone. And the next morning, the wind brought news. The townsfolk were coming. "They said you confessed," Sheriff Calhoun told her when she returned. He stood on her porch now, alone, the others keeping distance. Maeve raised an eyebrow. "To what?" "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "The words weren't yours." She looked past him, toward the crowd, toward the gallows. Tahu stood further back, half-shadowed beneath the church's overhang. He had promised not to interfere, not to fight them. "Let me try words first," she had asked him. "Let me try truth." He had nodded. Now she stepped forward, not with fire, but with grace. She walked past the sheriff, past the preacher, past every man who had spoken her name in judgment. She stood on the church steps. No one interrupted. She began softly. "You called me cursed, unlucky, touched by sin." Her voice trembled, but not from fear. "You said I walked with ghosts, and you weren't wrong. I carry grief, but so do you." A murmur rose. She continued. "You said I consorted with a savage, but the only savage thing I've known was how this town treated silence, treated pain, treated difference." She looked out over them. each face held in the weight of her gaze. I was not saved. I was seen. For the first time in years. And that, you called a crime. Then, she turned, walked back to Tahu, and took his hand. The wind blew, and no one followed. They left that afternoon, not in shame, in freedom. Maeve didn't look back. She didn't need to. They thought she was broken. But someone saw gold in the ashes. The land they settled on wasn't marked on any map. It lay just beyond the crooked bend of the river, past where the cottonwoods gave way to open plains, where the stars seemed to press closer at night, as if leaning in to listen. There, with her scar and his silence, they began again. Tahu built the frame of their cabin with hands steady and slow. Maeve hauled stone, stripped bark, laughed when the walls leaned crooked, then helped fix them. She learned to braid rope. He learned to drink her coffee, though it always came out too strong. They planted wildflowers near the door, red columbine, just like the ones that grew near her childhood fence. The wind carried their scent into the rafters. It smelled like home before it was ever finished. It wasn't easy. They bartered with traders for nails and seed, cut firewood in the early mornings. Their roof leaked that first week, and their bread never rose right. But when Maeve looked at Tahu one evening as they sat on the front step, rain dripping through her hair and into her collar, she smiled and said, "I've never been more warm." And she meant it. The fire was returning, not in the hearth, in her. The rumors reached them first. A rider passed through the hills selling pelts. He brought whispers like frost. The sheriff was asking questions. A preacher's widow had fallen ill. The judge had returned to town, and her name, Maeve, was once again being spoken over ledgers and ledgers of lies. Tahu didn't flinch. Maeve, however, felt her hands grow cold. "They'll try to take it back," she said quietly one night, staring into the fire. Tahu looked at her, puzzled. "What?" "All of this. They'll find a way. Say we stole the land. Say I escaped justice." His voice was gentle. "Truth needs no defense." She turned to him. "But hearts do." He placed a hand over hers. "Then we'll build stronger ones." And that night, he took her to a place he'd never shown another soul. It was a valley wrapped in mist and silence. Nestled between two sandstone cliffs, it held a spring that ran warm year-round, and a tree older than any building she'd ever known. Beneath it was a circle of stones, blackened with memory. "My mother brought me here when my voice broke," he said. "When the soldiers burned our winter camp and I forgot how to speak for a while. She called this the Earth's breath." Maeve placed her palm to the spring. Warmth bloomed up her wrist. Tahu stepped into the circle. "I never brought anyone here, until now." She watched him kneel. From the pouch around his neck, he drew something. A thin silver chain. At the end of it, a locket. He held it out to her. Inside, a pressed blossom. Half faded, still holding its shape. "She gave this to me the day I left. Told me, when you find someone worth starting again for, don't wait for the world to catch up, just begin." Maeve's breath caught. He pressed it into her hand. She closed her fingers around it. "Tahu, let them come," he said. "Let them whisper. Let them send storms." He reached out and touched her cheek. Just a graze, reverent and sure. "We've already weathered worse." And still, the wind turned. It wasn't the sheriff who came first, but something older. Winter. The storm rolled down from the mountains fast and without warning. Their woodpile vanished beneath snow. The stream froze. The horse limped on a cracked hoof. Maeve spent days at the stove, hands blistered, shoulders aching. Tahu came in one night with blood on his knuckles. Not from a fight, but from chopping. Through frozen soil to get to the buried roots he said could boil into tea. They were hungry, not starving, not yet, but the edge of it brushed against her throat at night like a blade. "I should go back," she whispered one evening, curled beneath the quilt. "Just for supplies. No one has to know I'm—" "No," Tahu said, sharper than usual. Then, softer, "No one goes back. But we. This land remembers." She looked at him. He wasn't angry. He was afraid. Not for himself, for her. "I can take the pain," she said. "I've done it before." "But you don't have to now," he replied. "That's what makes it different." She swallowed hard. He moved closer, wrapped both arms around her. No words, just warmth. And when she cried that night, it wasn't out of despair. It was because she was finally allowed to. The storm broke 2 days later. The sun returned, and so did the road, and with it, a letter left on a stone near the path. No seal, just her name. Inside, a single sentence: "The judge will listen, if you come alone." Maeve read it a dozen times before showing Tahu. He held the paper once, then set it on the fire. "You owe them nothing." She looked at the ash curling in the flame. "I know." But something deeper stirred. A choice. To walk away, or to finally face what tried to unmake her. She stood. "I'm not going for them. I'm going for me." And this time, when she packed her satchel, he didn't stop her. He only said, "I'll wait beneath the earth's breath until you return." And she left before dawn. The town had changed. The gallows were gone. The sheriff was grayer. The judge, quieter. They asked no questions. She gave no confessions. She simply spoke, not of guilt, not of innocence, but of grief and healing, and how some wounds don't ask for verdicts. They ask for mercy. When she was done, the judge leaned forward and said, "What you built is justice enough." She said nothing in reply. She didn't need to. When she returned to the valley, Tahu was waiting beneath the tree. She ran to him, and this time, when he reached for her, she didn't hesitate. They kissed beneath the branches. Thoda, earth's breath rising like smoke, and the fire inside them no longer flickered. It burned steady. Spring came quiet that year. The rivers thawed early. The cottonwoods budded pale green, and the wind softened, no longer a warning, but a welcome. Maeve stood at the edge of the field they'd cleared together, bare feet pressing into earth that remembered every step, every tear, every vow unspoken but understood. Tahu was mending the fence, a steady rhythm. Hammer, breath, hammer, breath. She watched him for a long moment, her heart so full it felt like it might spill. It had been months since she walked away from the town's whispers. Since the judge nodded once, gently, and said she was free. But freedom was never just a paper, signed. It was something she built with her own hands, day by day, board by board. She had not gone back to church. But every Sunday she sat beneath the tree in their hidden valley, where the earth breathed and the past rested. Sometimes she spoke aloud. Sometimes she just listened. One such morning, a letter came. The preacher's widow had passed, and in her will, she left something strange, a small silver bell once used to call the town's children to Sunday school. Alongside it, a note. For Maeve, the girl they tried to silence, may her voice always carry. She didn't cry when she read it, not until later, when she showed Tahu. He read it once, then folded it into the pages of her old journal, now stitched back together and covered in pressed flowers. That afternoon they walked to town, together, hand in hand, not to prove anything. Not to challenge anyone, but because it was time. And when they crossed the threshold of the town square, the place where they had nearly hanged her, nearly exiled him, no one turned them away. No one whispered. Instead, a girl offered them wild daisies. An old man tipped his hat. The baker's wife waved from the porch. It wasn't a parade, but it was peace. That night they returned home, and Maeve surprised him. She wore the shawl her mother left her, stitched now with red thread, where it had once torn. Her hair was braided with blue feathers. She stepped into the clearing barefoot, holding a circle of woven wild grass. Tahu froze and smiled. They didn't need a preacher. Just the stars, and the silence between two hearts that no longer feared what others would call them. He took the circle from her hands, kissed her forehead, and whispered something in his native tongue. She didn't ask what it meant. She just whispered back, "Yes." A year passed, then two. They built a barn, a second room, a bench facing the sunset. Maeve painted again, images of red rock and deep rivers, of stars and hands and hope. And one evening, in the hush before dusk, she placed a sleeping child in Tahu's arms. The boy's eyes were wide and quiet, like his father's. She named him Ashen, not for fire destroyed, but for what rises after it. The town still spoke of them, but not in fear. They became a story told softly at night. Over firelight and tea, the girl who was nearly hanged, and the man they once called savage, who found something purer than vengeance, who chose to build, not burn, who taught the town, slowly, how to see again. And every spring, when the columbine bloomed red by their doorstep, Maeve would whisper, a small prayer, not for protection, but for remembrance, that love does not always roar. Sometimes it plants its roots in broken ground and becomes a garden. She was never a curse. She was someone's miracle all along. Subscribe, and let me introduce you to the next miracle tomorrow.